On January 21, 1968, just 9 days before the Tet Offensive would explode across South Vietnam, North Vietnamese artillery opened fire on the United States Marine base at Khe Sanh. Over 1,000 rounds, rockets, mortars, a massive barrage that lit up the pre-dawn darkness and announced the beginning of what would become one of the longest and most famous battles of the entire Vietnam War. For 77 days, approximately 6,000 Marines and South Vietnamese troops would hold that remote outpost near the Laotian border, while an estimated 20,000 North Vietnamese soldiers surrounded them. For 77 days, the base would be pounded by artillery fire, probed by infantry attacks, cut off from ground supply routes. For 77 days, the American command would pour resources into defending that base. Reinforcements, ammunition, food, medical supplies, all delivered by air. And for 77 days, the American military establishment would be obsessed with Khe Sanh, convinced that it was where the North Vietnamese would make their stand. General William Westmoreland, commander of United States forces in Vietnam, was certain of it. President Lyndon Johnson, watching from the White House with a scale model of Khe Sanh built in the basement so he could follow the battle, was convinced. The American media, drawing comparisons to Dien Bien Phu, the French defeat in 1954 that had ended France's colonial presence in Indochina, reported breathlessly on the siege. Everyone believed Khe Sanh was the main event. The place where North Vietnam's legendary general Vo Nguyen Giap would attempt to repeat his greatest victory, the battle that would determine the course of the war. They were wrong. While 30,000 American and South Vietnamese troops, nearly 50 maneuver battalions, half of all U.S. combat troops in Vietnam, were diverted to the northern provinces to defend Khe Sanh and prepare for the expected major offensive there, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were preparing something else entirely. 9 days after the siege began, on January 30th and 31st, more than 84,000 communist soldiers launched coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive, the real target, the main event, and the American command, fixated on Khe Sanh, had largely ignored the intelligence indicating that something big was coming in the cities. This is the story of the siege at Khe Sanh. Not the story you've probably heard, the heroic defense, the Marines holding out against impossible odds, the successful relief operation. That's all true. But it's not the whole story. The whole story is about how the United States military became so obsessed with defending a remote base in the middle of nowhere that they diverted massive resources away from the real threat. About how General Westmoreland's fear of repeating Dien Bien Phu blinded him to what was actually happening. About how a siege that was loudly proclaimed as a great American victory was quietly abandoned just 2 months after it ended. And about the question that historians have been arguing about for over 50 years. Was Khe Sanh a diversion to draw American attention away from the cities before Tet? Or was Tet a diversion to take pressure off Khe Sanh? The answer, it turns out, matters. Because if Khe Sanh was a diversion, if the North Vietnamese deliberately tied up 30,000 American troops at a remote base while they prepared to attack the cities, then the 77-day siege wasn't a victory at all. It was exactly what the enemy wanted. Khe Sanh Combat Base sat in the northwestern corner of Quang Tri Province, about 14 miles south of the demilitarized zone that separated North and South Vietnam, and 6 miles from the Laotian border. The area was rugged, the An Namita Range, covered in triple canopy jungle, peaks and valleys, difficult terrain. Route 9, the main east-west highway below the DMZ, ran through the area, connecting the coast to Laos. The base had started small. In July 1962, Army Special Forces built a camp there to keep watch on North Vietnamese infiltration along the border. By 1966, Marines had built it up into a proper combat base with a hard surface runway capable of landing C-130 transport planes. From a strategic perspective, you could make arguments for why Khe Sanh mattered. It was positioned to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of supply routes the North Vietnamese used to move troops and supplies south through Laos and Cambodia. It could serve as a jumping-off point for operations into Laos. It anchored the western end of the defensive line below the DMZ. But you could also make arguments for why Khe Sanh didn't matter at all. It was isolated, far from everything. "When you're at Khe Sanh, you're not really anywhere," said General Lowell E. English, Assistant Division Commander of the 3rd Marine Division. "It's far away from everything. You could lose it and you really haven't lost a damn thing." Marine commanders generally didn't want to be there. They thought the base was vulnerable, surrounded by high ground that the enemy could use to direct artillery fire, cut off from the coast by poor roads that were easily interdicted, dependent on air supply in an area where weather could be terrible. More than one Marine general argued that defending Khe Sanh wasn't worth the risk, but Westmoreland wanted it held. He saw Khe Sanh as an opportunity, a place where American firepower could be brought to bear against North Vietnamese forces. A killing ground. The kind of set-piece battle where the American military's superiority in artillery and air support would devastate the enemy. By late 1967, intelligence indicated that the North Vietnamese were building up forces in the area. Lots of forces, multiple divisions, tens of thousands of troops. To Westmoreland, that meant one thing: the North Vietnamese were planning something big. And Khe Sanh was where it would happen. He was convinced, absolutely convinced, that General Giap intended to repeat his triumph at Dien Bien Phu. In 1954, Giap had surrounded the French base at Dien Bien Phu, cut off all ground access, pounded it with artillery from the surrounding hills, and eventually overrun it, ending France's presence in Indochina and leading directly to the Geneva Conference that divided Vietnam in two. The parallels seemed obvious. Remote base, surrounded by high ground, outnumbered garrison, cut off from reinforcement by land. If Giap could do it to the French, why not to the Americans? Westmoreland was determined not to let that happen. He ordered Khe Sanh reinforced. The 26th Marine Regiment, about 6,000 troops when fully reinforced, would defend the base. Artillery support from Camp Carroll and the rock pile to the east. Overwhelming air support. B-52 bombers, fighter bombers, helicopter gunships, everything the American military could throw at the problem. And he moved forces north? Lots of forces. By the end of January 1968, Westmoreland had moved half of all U.S. combat troops, nearly 50 maneuver battalions, to A Corps, the northernmost military region of South Vietnam. 30,000 troops, maybe more, all focused on the northern provinces, all positioned to defend against the expected offensive at Khe Sanh and along the DMZ, which meant they weren't in the cities, weren't in the Mekong Delta, weren't in the Central Highlands, weren't positioned to defend against attacks anywhere else. On January 20th, a North Vietnamese defector walked into the Marine lines and told Colonel David Lowndes, commander of the 26th Marines, that an attack was imminent. Lowndes passed the warning up the chain. The Marines went to full alert. The next morning, just after 5 a.m. on January 21st, it began. Reconnaissance teams spotted rockets being launched from nearby hills, about 182mm mortar rounds and 61 22mm rockets. Not a huge barrage by the standards of what would come later, but devastating nonetheless. One rocket landed in the main ammunition storage area. 11,000 rounds of ordnance, artillery shells, recoilless rifle rounds, mortar rounds began burning, exploding, chain reacting, red-hot metal flying everywhere. CS tear gas ignited, filling the area with gas so thick you couldn't see. Around 10 a.m., the fire reached a large quantity of C4 plastic explosive. 90% of the base's ammunition supply gone. Just like that, in the first 15 minutes of the siege. Simultaneously, about 300 North Vietnamese soldiers attacked Hill 861, one of several hilltop positions surrounding the main base. Fierce hand-to-hand combat. The Marines held, but it was close. The siege had begun. For the next 77 days, the approximately 6,000 defenders at Khe Sanh would live under constant bombardment. The North Vietnamese had positioned artillery in the hills surrounding the base, hills that extended across the border into Laos, where American forces couldn't attack them without violating Laotian neutrality. From those positions, enemy artillery could hit anywhere in the base. And they did. Constantly. Hundreds of rounds per day. Sometimes over 1,000. Rockets, mortars, artillery. The Marines dug in, built bunkers, reinforced positions with sandbags. But the base was only about a mile across. There was nowhere to hide. Life during the siege was hellish. Constant noise. Incoming fire, outgoing fire, aircraft overhead, explosions. Red dust everywhere from the constant digging and bulldozing and impact of shells. Smoke from diesel generators, from burning ordnance, from trash fires, from incoming artillery. The smell of unwashed bodies. Water was scarce, and what little there was certainly wasn't for bathing. Rats. Lots of rats. The Marines called it looking like a shanty slum on the outskirts of Manila. The mess halls were shut down, too dangerous to have 200 Marines congregated in one place. Everyone ate sea rations in their bunkers. Sleep was impossible. You never knew when the next barrage would start. And every time you had to move above ground, to go to a different position, to carry supplies, to evacuate wounded, you risked getting hit. More than 1,300 rounds a day in February. The ground shook constantly. Bunkers collapsed, trenches caved in. Men died from direct hits, from shrapnel, from being in the wrong place when a shell landed nearby. On January 24th, the North Vietnamese overran Lang Vây, a special forces camp west of Khe Sanh on Route 9. They used tanks. The first time North Vietnamese forces had used armor in the war. 155 defenders killed. The camp destroyed. The last American position west of Khe Sanh gone. The Marines were completely surrounded now. Cut off. No ground access. Everything, food, water, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, reinforcements, mail, everything had to come in by air. And the North Vietnamese made that as dangerous as possible. Anti-aircraft fire. Mortars zeroed in on the runway. Rocket attacks timed for when aircraft were landing or taking off. Some planes made it, some didn't. Some crashed, some took hits and limped away trailing smoke. The Americans responded with firepower. Massive amounts of it. More firepower than had been concentrated on any piece of ground anywhere in the history of warfare up to that point. Operation Niagara. That's what they called the air campaign. Tactical fighter bombers flew more than 16,000 sorties, dropping over 31,000 tons of bombs. B-52 Arc light strikes delivered nearly 60,000 tons. 100,000 tons of bombs total, equivalent to 5 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons. Artillery from Camp Carroll and the Rock Pile. 175-millimeter guns that could reach Khe Sanh. Thousands and thousands of rounds. The hills around Khe Sanh were turned into a moonscape, craters everywhere, trees shredded, vegetation burned away. The Americans created what they called a free fire zone around the base. Anything that moved in that zone was fair game. No questions asked. The CIA estimated that North Vietnamese replacement troops arriving at Khe Sanh averaged 190 to 380 per day during the siege, which means the total number of North Vietnamese soldiers engaged in the battle over that period could have been as high as 44,000. And American firepower killed thousands of them. Estimates range from 10,000 to 15,000 North Vietnamese dead. Bodies found in the impact zones, craters filled with parts of bodies. The smell, those who were there never forgot the smell. The Marines at Khe Sanh held. They fought off ground attacks on the hill positions, they endured the artillery barrages, they maintained their defensive positions, and they waited for relief. While all this was happening, while the nation and the military command were fixated on Khe Sanh, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were preparing for Tet. Intelligence had been picking up signs, increased enemy activity, movement of forces, supplies being positioned. Reports from various sources indicating that something was being planned. But the American command was focused on Khe Sanh. Westmoreland was convinced that Khe Sanh was the main effort, that Giap was preparing for a major battle there, that the build-up in the cities was secondary, maybe even a diversion to take attention away from Khe Sanh. On January 29th, the South Vietnamese government announced a ceasefire for Tet, the Lunar New Year holiday. Most years, both sides observed an unofficial truce during Tet. Soldiers went home to be with their families. Fighting paused, however briefly. But on the afternoon of January 29th, the 3rd Marine Division notified Khe Sanh that the truce had been cancelled. Something was happening. On the night of January 30th and 31st, during the Tet holiday, more than 84,000 communist soldiers launched simultaneous attacks throughout South Vietnam. More than 100 cities and towns, 36 of South Vietnam's 48 provinces, the capital of Saigon, the ancient city of Hue, major American bases, provincial capitals, district towns, everywhere except Khe Sanh. The Tet Offensive exploded with terrifying suddenness. In Saigon, Viet Cong sappers breached the walls of the American embassy, the symbol of American presence in Vietnam, and fought in the embassy courtyard for hours before being killed. Throughout the capital, communist forces attacked government buildings, military installations, radio stations. The city descended into chaos. In Hue, North Vietnamese forces occupied most of the city, including the ancient imperial citadel. It would take 26 days of brutal house-to-house fighting to retake the city. Thousands of South Vietnamese civilians would be murdered by communist forces during the occupation, their bodies later found in mass graves. Throughout the country, American and South Vietnamese forces scrambled to respond to the attacks. Firefights erupted in city streets. Helicopter gunships strafed urban areas. Artillery fired into populated neighborhoods. Fighter bombers dropped bombs on cities, and the American command was caught off guard. Not completely. They knew something was coming, but the scale of it, the coordination, the fact that it was happening in the cities, not just at Khe Sanh, that was unexpected, because they'd been focused on Khe Sanh, because 30,000 American troops, half of all combat forces, had been moved to Ire Corps, because Westmoreland had been convinced that Khe Sanh was the main event. The irony is almost painful. While American forces were concentrated in the north, waiting for the big battle at Khe Sanh, the North Vietnamese launched their offensive everywhere else. Now, to be fair, the Tet Offensive was a military failure for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. They failed to spark the general uprising among the South Vietnamese population that they'd hoped for. They failed to hold any of the cities they'd occupied. They took massive casualties. Estimates range from 40,000 to 58,000 killed. Within a few weeks, most communist forces had been driven out of the cities. American and South Vietnamese forces, once they recovered from the initial shock, fought effectively. The Viet Cong, in particular, were devastated. They'd never again be a significant fighting force. From a strictly military perspective, Tet was an American and South Vietnamese victory. But from a strategic and political perspective, it was a disaster for the United States. Because the Tet Offensive shattered the narrative that the American military and the Johnson administration had been selling to the American people, the narrative that the war was being won, that progress was being made, that the enemy was weak and getting weaker. If the enemy was so weak, how did they manage to launch simultaneous attacks on over 100 cities? How did they get inside the American embassy? How were they able to occupy Hue for nearly a month? The American public, watching the offensive unfold on television, stopped believing what they were being told. Public support for the war collapsed. The anti-war movement gained strength. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted news anchor in America, declared after visiting Vietnam that the war was unwinnable. On March 31st, President Johnson announced he was halting most of the bombing of North Vietnam and opening peace negotiations, and he announced he would not run for re-election. The Tet Offensive changed everything, and it worked, at least in part, because American forces had been diverted north to defend Khe Sanh. So was Khe Sanh a diversion? Was that the plan all along, to draw American forces away from the cities while preparing for the real offensive? Historians have been arguing about this for decades. They call it the riddle of Khe Sanh. Some argue that Khe Sanh was the main objective, and Tet was a diversion to take pressure off the siege. Others argue the opposite, that Khe Sanh was a feint to draw forces away from the cities. Still others argue that both operations were part of an integrated strategy, each supporting the other. The North Vietnamese haven't been much help in settling the debate. Their official history is largely silent on the question. Different commanders have given different answers over the years, but here's what we know. Vietnamese theater commander Vo Nguyen Giap later claimed that Khe Sanh itself was not of importance, but only a diversion to draw U.S. forces away from the populated areas of South Vietnam. We know that the siege of Khe Sanh began 9 days before the Tet Offensive, just enough time for American forces to rush reinforcements north, just enough time for Westmoreland to move half his combat troops to I Corps, just enough time for everyone to be looking in the wrong direction. We know that the North Vietnamese never actually tried to overrun Khe Sanh. They shelled it constantly. They probed the defenses. They attacked the hill positions, but they never launched the kind of all-out assault that would be necessary to actually take the base. Almost as if they didn't really want to take it. As if keeping the Americans pinned down there was good enough. We know that when the Tet Offensive began, North Vietnamese forces started withdrawing from around Khe Sanh. Not immediately, the siege continued, but the pressure lessened. As if the North Vietnamese had accomplished what they wanted to accomplish, and we know that by early March, North Vietnamese forces were pulling back. Operation Pegasus, the relief operation, began on April 1st. By April 8th, ground contact with Khe Sanh had been re-established. The siege was over. American commanders proclaimed it a great victory. The base had been held. The Marines had endured 77 days of siege and come out on top. Enemy casualties were massive, 10 to 15,000 dead by American estimates. American casualties were relatively light, about 274 killed during the siege proper, though the total numbers for all operations around Khe Sanh from November 67 through July 68 reached about 1,000. Westmoreland declared, "The amount of firepower put on that piece of real estate exceeded anything that has ever been seen before in history by any foe. The enemy was hurt, his back was broken by air power." It was a victory. The base had been successfully defended. The Marines had proven their courage and resilience. American firepower had inflicted devastating casualties on the North Vietnamese. Except that on June 11th, 1968, just 2 months after the siege ended, General Westmoreland relinquished command of U.S. forces in Vietnam. He was promoted to Army Chief of Staff and returned to Washington. General Creighton Abrams took over as commander of Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, and one of Abrams's first decisions was to abandon Khe Sanh. On June 19, 1968, Operation Charlie began, the evacuation and destruction of Khe Sanh Combat Base. The Marines salvaged what equipment they could. Everything else was destroyed. Bunkers blown up, fortifications demolished, trenches filled in with bulldozers. On July 5th, the base was officially closed. The last Marines pulled out on July 6th, setting fire to what remained as they left, the base they'd fought so hard to defend. The position that had been deemed so strategically critical that 30,000 troops had been diverted to defend it. The place that President Johnson had tracked so obsessively that he'd built a scale model in the White House basement. Abandoned. Destroyed. As if it had never mattered at all. The official explanation was that the military situation had changed, that the base was no longer needed, that American forces now had enough mobility, enough helicopters, enough air mobile capability that they didn't need fixed bases in remote locations. But the Marines who defended Khe Sanh saw it differently. They saw it as an admission that the base had never been worth defending in the first place, that they'd endured 77 days of hell, that nearly 300 Marines had died, that thousands had been wounded, for nothing. The North Vietnamese saw it as a victory. They launched a propaganda campaign, claiming they'd forced the Americans to abandon the base. That American explanations about changed military situations were face-saving lies. That Khe Sanh proved the Americans could be defeated, and they weren't entirely wrong. According to military historian Peter Brush, Khe Sanh was the only occasion in which Americans abandoned a major combat base due to enemy pressure. Think about what that means. The United States military, with all its firepower and resources and technological superiority, fought for 77 days to defend a base, proclaimed victory, and then abandoned it 2 months later. If that's a victory, what does defeat look like? The question that haunts Khe Sanh isn't whether the Marines fought bravely. They did. It isn't whether American firepower killed thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers. It did. It isn't whether the base was successfully defended during the siege. It was. The question is, should the base have been defended at all? Westmoreland argued yes. He believed Khe Sanh served vital strategic purposes. It tied down North Vietnamese forces. It created a killing ground where American firepower could devastate the enemy. It protected the northern provinces and prevented North Vietnamese divisions from pouring down Route 9. But critics pointed out that Khe Sanh tied down American forces just as much as it tied down North Vietnamese forces. More, actually. By the end of January, Westmoreland had moved half of all U.S. combat troops to I Corps, 50 maneuver battalions, 30,000 men. To defend one base and prepare for an offensive that came somewhere else. And the North Vietnamese forces at Khe Sanh? They withdrew when it suited them. They'd accomplished what they wanted, diverting American attention and resources while preparing for Tet. When Tet failed militarily, they pulled back from Khe Sanh. Mission accomplished. General Tolson, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division who led Operation Pegasus, wasn't happy about being assigned to relieve Khe Sanh. He believed the best use of his division after Tet would have been attacking into the A Shau Valley, disrupting North Vietnamese supply lines and base areas. Instead, he had to waste resources on a relief operation that wouldn't have been necessary if the base had never been reinforced in the first place. More than 400 American troops were killed and 2,300 wounded in the 10 weeks following the end of the siege. More than twice the casualties sustained during the siege itself. Fighting continued around Khe Sanh through July. Marines died clearing the area. Helicopters were shot down, all to protect a base that was being dismantled and abandoned. What was the point? The most painful part of the Khe Sanh story might be that the Marines who defended it knew, or at least suspected, that it wasn't worth defending. "When you're at Khe Sanh, you're not really anywhere," General English had said. Marine commanders had argued against reinforcing the base. They'd pointed out its vulnerabilities. They'd suggested that defending it would tie down forces that could be better used elsewhere. But Westmoreland insisted. And so the Marines went and did their job, and held the base against overwhelming odds, and endured 77 days of artillery barrages and rocket attacks and constant danger, and watched their friends die. And then, 2 months after it ended, they watched the base being abandoned, destroyed, as if none of it had mattered. One Marine who was there from December 67 until April 68 later wrote, "There was no sense that we were a defeated force, and I had no idea the base was scheduled for closing. My Marine unit was told that we would remain at Khe Sanh until another mortar battery could replace us. They had no idea. The Marines on the ground, the ones doing the fighting and dying, weren't told that the base they were defending was about to be abandoned. They thought they were holding a vital position. They thought their sacrifice meant something, and maybe it did. Maybe the sacrifice of those Marines, their courage, their resilience, their willingness to endure hell, meant something regardless of whether the base itself was strategically important. But it's hard not to feel that they were used. That Westmoreland's obsession with Khe Sanh, his fear of repeating Dien Bien Phu, his conviction that he could lure the North Vietnamese into a decisive battle, led him to make a decision that put thousands of Marines in a position they never should have been in. And it's hard not to see Khe Sanh as a perfect metaphor for the entire Vietnam War. A position of questionable strategic value defended at great cost, massive firepower employed to kill thousands of enemy soldiers. Victory proclaimed loudly. And then, quietly, an admission that it wasn't worth it after all. Withdrawal, abandonment, moving on to the next thing, leaving behind the question, what was it all for? The numbers tell part of the story. During the siege, January 21st to April 8th, approximately 274 Americans were killed. During the entire Khe Sanh operations from November 67 through July 68, about 1,000 Americans died, thousands more wounded. North Vietnamese casualties were much higher, 10 to 15,000 killed according to American estimates. The North Vietnamese disputed those numbers, but even their own reports acknowledged significant losses. 100,000 tons of bombs dropped on the area around Khe Sanh, the equivalent of 5 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons. The hills turned into cratered moonscapes. Vegetation destroyed. Wildlife killed. The land itself transformed into a dead zone. All to defend a base that was abandoned 2 months after the siege ended. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. They don't tell you what it was like to be there, to spend 77 days under constant bombardment, to never know if the next shell would land on your bunker, to watch friends die from random incoming rounds, to smell the smoke and the dust and the unwashed bodies and the death. They don't tell you what it was like to be evacuated by helicopter under fire, never knowing if you'd make it out alive, or to be the helicopter crew flying into Khe Sanh again and again, running the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire and mortars, knowing that some flights didn't make it back. They don't tell you what it was like to be an infantryman at Khe Sanh, sitting in a bunker eating sea rations and wondering why you were defending this place in the middle of nowhere while the war was exploding in the cities to the south. And they don't tell you what it was like to be a Marine who survived Khe Sanh, who came home and tried to explain what you'd been through, only to watch the news and see that the base had been abandoned, that it was being called the only occasion in which Americans abandoned a major combat base due to enemy pressure. That all of it, the 77 days, the casualties, the fear, the sacrifice, had been for a position that the military decided wasn't worth keeping after all. The Vietnam War is full of questions that don't have good answers. Why were we there? What were we fighting for? How do you win a war when the enemy won't stand and fight? How do you measure progress in a conflict with no front lines? Khe Sanh adds another question. How do you justify asking soldiers to defend a position that you're planning to abandon? The answer, probably, is that Westmoreland didn't plan to abandon it. He genuinely believed Khe Sanh was strategically important. He genuinely thought that defending it would lead to a decisive battle that would devastate North Vietnamese forces and change the course of the war. He was wrong. But the Marines at Khe Sanh didn't know he was wrong. They followed orders. They defended the base. They did their duty. And maybe that's the lesson. That the courage and sacrifice of the soldiers who fought at Khe Sanh wasn't diminished by the fact that the base was later abandoned. That doing your duty, standing by your fellow Marines, holding your position against impossible odds, maybe that matters regardless of whether the strategic decision to put you there was right or wrong. But it's cold comfort. Khe Sanh stands as one of the most famous battles of the Vietnam War. Books have been written about it. Documentaries made, veterans' reunions held. The site is now a museum, preserved with restored bunkers and exhibits of weapons and photographs. Tourists visit. Veterans make pilgrimages. People stand where the base once was and try to imagine what it must have been like. But here's what they should remember. Khe Sanh wasn't just about the 77-day siege. It wasn't just about the heroic defense or the massive application of American firepower or the high body count. It was about a military command so fixated on one battle that they ignored warning signs of something bigger. About 30,000 troops diverted to defend a remote base while the enemy prepared to attack everywhere else. About a siege that may have been exactly what the enemy wanted. A diversion to draw American forces away from the real targets. It was about a base proclaimed so vital that the President of the United States built a scale model of it in the White House basement to track the battle, then abandoned 2 months after the siege ended. And it was about the question that has haunted Vietnam veterans and historians ever since. Was Khe Sanh a victory? Or was it exactly what the North Vietnamese wanted? American forces tied down, resources diverted, attention focused on the wrong place while they prepared for Tet. The riddle of Khe Sanh may never be fully answered. The North Vietnamese official history is largely silent on the issue. Different commanders have given different explanations. Some say Khe Sanh was meant to be a major offensive. Others say it was a diversion. But here's what we know for certain. The siege began 9 days before Tet. Just enough time to get everyone looking north. By the end of January, half of all U.S. combat troops, nearly 50 maneuver battalions, had been moved to I Corps. 30,000 men focused on defending Khe Sanh and the northern provinces. The Tet Offensive exploded everywhere except Khe Sanh. Over 100 cities and towns attacked simultaneously while American forces were concentrated in the north. The North Vietnamese never tried to actually overrun Khe Sanh. They shelled it, probed it, tied down the defenders, but they never launched the kind of all-out assault that would be needed to take it. When Tet failed militarily, North Vietnamese forces withdrew from around Khe Sanh. 2 months after the siege ended, the base was abandoned and destroyed. General Giap later said Khe Sanh was only a diversion to draw U.S. forces away from the populated areas. Put it all together, and it's hard not to conclude that Khe Sanh was exactly what it appeared to be. A diversion, a successful one. The Marines who defended Khe Sanh didn't know they were being diverted. They thought they were fighting the main battle. They thought the sacrifice meant something. And maybe it did. Maybe their courage and resilience and determination proved something important about the American fighting spirit. Maybe holding that base against overwhelming odds was a victory in itself, regardless of the larger strategic picture. But 30,000 American troops diverted north. Half of all combat forces. 50 maneuver battalions. while the real offensive was being prepared in the cities. That's the siege that diverted 30,000 troops from the real target. And in the end, the base wasn't even worth keeping.